Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all. This is Claude Grunitzky. This is our weekly webinar, which is a partnership between True Africa University, MIT Africa, and the MIT Center for International Studies. It's so great to have you here again. We've been on a roll. We've had a really good lineup this season. And this season has one of the highlights today as well, with our special guest, who is from South Africa. And she actually appeared on one of our most popular episodes for the Limitless Africa podcast that we produce every Monday, that is about African solutions to African problems. And her name is Busisiwe Seabe. She is a social justice activist in South Africa, and she's an author. She's also a researcher, a speechwriter, and a legislation manager in the Gauteng provincial legislature. Gauteng is basically Greater Johannesburg. She's also, and this is going to be the focus of today's webinar discussion, she is one of the leaders of the Fees Must Fall movement. And Fees Must Fall, which is going to, again, be what we dissect today, is a student-led protest movement that began in October 2015 at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg and spread to the University of Cape Town and also Rhodes University before spreading to other universities across South Africa. And the reason these protests started is because the leadership of the University of Witwatersrand announced that tuition fees would increase by 10.5% between 2015 and 2016. And this was a problem because this tuition fee increase actually shed light on much deeper problems within South African society. Now, I'm focusing on this part of the actually motivation because this work is very much in line with the research that our incoming director for the MIT Center for International Studies, Evan Lieberman, has been doing. He's just published a book on South Africa. This is what he focuses on. And that was one of the really important moments in the new struggle for liberation and youth liberation in South Africa. So without further ado, I will introduce Busisiwe Seabe. And I'm just hoping that we have a good Wi-Fi connection throughout, because I was in South Africa 2 months ago, and at that time there was load shedding, basically power cuts every single day, and it used to last between 2 and 4 hours. And we're told that this load shedding is now lasting up to 8 hours each day. So I'm hoping that the electricity and the Wi-Fi communicate and cooperate with us. And so without further ado, I would like to introduce Busisiwe Seabe, one of the leaders of Fees Must Fall.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's afternoon over in the States. On my end, it's evening time. But more than anything, I am honored to be presenting on the Fees Must Fall movement, which is a student-led movement that is very close to my heart, considering that it is one of my brainchildren, along with other activists in South Africa. As mentioned, I am a social justice activist in South Africa on issues ranging from higher education to basic education to violence, crime, gender-based violence, and all other social economic issues in the country. So without further delay, I just want to get into my presentation today, and hopefully we'll be able to engage with one another thoroughly in the question and answer session that will follow my presentation. And more than anything else, I do hope that I'm able to teach you something, and I hope that I will also equally learn something from you during the question and answer session. So my presentation is titled The South African Fees Must Fall Movement, which is essentially a struggle for free, quality, decolonized education. Next slide, please. So when we speak about the Fees Must Fall movement, I think just to have a word or play on words, when you think about Helen of Troy, the beautiful face that launched 1,000 ships, you can think about the Fees Must Fall movement to a large extent as a movement that was launched by, the feces debacle that happened at the University of Cape Town by a student by the name of Tumani Machwele, who decided to throw feces on the statue of Cecile John Rhodes, who was, the statue was positioned outside the university. And in one of the pictures that you see there, that is essentially Tumani in the pink hat that is throwing feces on the statue of Cecile John Rhodes. And what that particularly did in the country more than anything else was that it created a moment for South Africans and the country and the continent at large to reflect on our colonial history. So this particular moment is known as the Rhodes Must Fall movement, which predates the Fees Must Fall movement, as the Rhodes Must Fall movement started in March, on the 9th of March, 2015, whereas the Fees Must Fall movement, which became the national movement and the national struggle for free, quality, decolonized education, began in October of the very same year. So I just want to begin by giving you a bit of context with regards to the Rhodes Must Fall movement, because I believe if you understand the context of the Rhodes Must Fall movement, you'll easily be able to understand how then it transformed into the Fees Must Fall movement. So the Rhodes Must Fall movement essentially was an independent, collective of students, workers, and staff who had come together to end institutionalized racism and patriarchy at UCT. So this movement was sparked by Tumani, as I mentioned, and it was a radical protest against the statue of Cecile John Rhodes on the 9th of March in 2015. This had brought to the surface, existing and justified rage from Black students in the oppressive space cultivated by the University of Cape Town, which is considered to be one of the best institutions of higher learning in South Africa and on the continent as well. So despite the rhetoric of transformation that a lot of institutions of higher learning purport or report on, students, or particularly students of color, Black students at institutions of higher learning, found themselves in a particular space where they didn't feel as though the transformation that the universities had purported reflected their lived experiences. So essentially what happened was, the Rhodes Must Fall movement and the students therein wanted to be clear about the fact that the movement was not concerned really about the removal of the statue, because the statue was more of a symbolic power. That glorified mass murder, the mass murderer Cecile John Rhodes, who exploited Black labor and stole land from indigenous people in South Africa. So its presence on the campus at UCT, erased Black history and was an act of violence against Black students, workers, and staff. And by Black, I'm referring to people of color. So the statue essentially was therefore the natural starting point of this movement. Its removal did not mark the end, but the beginning of a long overdue process of decolonizing the university. When you speak to students who were a part of the Rhodes Must Fall movement, what you will learn from them is that their belief is that their experiences sought to address the unique and elitism that was in institutions of higher learning, such as UCT. But to a large extent also, what then happened was, following the launch of the movement, what happened was then, students from across the country at different institutions of higher learning then had a meeting, because, you're sitting at home and you turn on the news and all of a sudden you see the statue of Cecile John Rhodes being defaced and feces being thrown on the statue. And you begin to have internal conversation and external conversations, within student circles all around the country around what motivated, the beginning of this movement, or what motivated Tumani to do this. So from March 2015 all the way up to October 2015, when the Fees Must Must Fall movement started, we had been engaging in various conversations as students from different institutions. I particularly at that particular point in time was based at Wits University, which is another, historically white institution in South Africa. And I was part of the SRC at Wits University, and SRC would essentially mean the Student Representative Council. And when we had a meeting with Xhumani and the RHODES Must Fall movement leaders, we began to understand that the struggles that students were facing at UCT and in other, white institutions were the same struggles that, TVET colleges and other institutions that are considered to be historically Black had been facing. So at that particular point in time, the throwing of the feces became the launch pad of, the revolutionary student movement that is known as Fees Must Fall today. Next slide, please. So when speaking about the RHODES Must Fall movement, I've just particularly outlined some of the demands that students had, presented to the university management with regards to the removal of the statue and placards on campus that celebrate white supremacy, the removal also of, objects and curricula that was anti-Black and did not reflect African epistemology. And this is where, to a large extent, the notion around decolonization comes in, around the notion of epistemology, or particularly African epistemology. So as you see here, these are some of the demands that, the UCT RHODES Must Fall movement had presented to their university and also to the state, because when looking at the institution of higher learning in South Africa, it's important to understand that the state subsidizes to a large extent a lot of, or pays a particular percentage to universities in order for them to broaden access and in order for them also to function effectively outside of just relying on student fees. So at this particular point in time, the RHODES Must Fall movement presented their mission statement, which was a list of demands, and the list of demands is very long. They had approximately about 25 demands. Some of them I have been able to list right there that reflected to a large extent a lot of what the students were complaining about, and a lot of the issues that the students had felt were part of the root cause for the beginning of the RHODES Must Fall movement. And one thing that is particular that I'd like to mention with regards to the demands that were made by students is that a lot of the demands were centered around Black pain. And what that means is that at the root of the struggle of RHODES Must Fall was the dehumanization of Black people at UCT, and by extension, other institutions of higher learning. So this dehumanization was a violence that was enacted only against Black people by a system that privileges whiteness, and that privileges colonialism, supremacy, and class divisions within our society. Now, we consider universities to be microcosms of society. And when you think about universities as microcosms of society, you begin to understand that what happens in institutions of higher learning reflects a lot of what happens in society. So when we talk about centering Black pain and centering the dehumanization of Black people at UCT, that is extended nationally and broadly into society to speak about the dehumanization of Black people in general in our society, not only by institutions like the state, like our legal system, but also in the nucleus of the family, right? We find to a large extent that as Black people, we have been reproducing the kind of dehumanization that we have been colonized and indoctrinated with. So when the RHODES Must Fall movement happens, it challenges a lot of the issues in society, in our homes, and in institutions of higher learning that people did not necessarily want to pay attention to, or people thought would magically disappear, considering the fact that when the Fees Must Fall movement started, we had been 24 years into our democracy. So next slide, please. So the list of demands that were presented to institutions of higher learning formed the basis of a lot of the demands that, you know, the Fees Must Fall movement then adopted and presented to our government and to the president of South Africa, who was at the time former President Jacob Zuma, and the Minister of Higher Education, who was Bladen Nzimande. So a lot of these demands were then adapted to suit the context of each each individual institution of higher learning in order to reflect a lot of the issues and the challenges that students were facing. A lot of the challenges that students were facing, and at the center of them was that there was no bridging gap between high school and university. So you find a situation where, for an example, accessing institutions of higher learning in South Africa becomes extremely difficult, especially if you are a person of color. And when you finally do, gain access into an institution of higher learning, that institution then dehumanizes you by, centering and privileging whiteness. So to a large extent, entering into institutions of higher learning required Black people to denounce themselves, required Black people to, think around the notions of being inferior and operate from an inferiority complex, as opposed to creating spaces where people could belong, creating spaces where people could self-actualize, and creating spaces where people could essentially contribute to the fabric of society, regardless of the degree that they were studying. So what we found, as the Fees Must Fall movement, as we were going, across campuses after the RHODES Must Fall movement started, was that we had shared and similar experiences. But more than anything else, the straw that broke the camel's back was when our government and our institutions of higher learning, because they work in conjunction with one another, decided to increase fees at institutions of higher learning. So we moved from the trajectory of wanting to remove colonial symbols that continue to repress and oppress us in institutions of higher learning, to having a situation where access is continuously restricted through the increasing of fees, to an extent where Black people aren't able to access institutions of higher learning. So if you think about the history of South Africa, you'll be able to understand a fundamental point to say that a lot of our parents and our great-grandparents were educated under a system called the Bantu education system. So we're coming from a background where our parents essentially learned the basics of reading and writing, but were never allowed access into institutions of higher learning. And even if they were allowed access into institutions of higher learning, they had to go to what we consider to be historically Black universities. And those historically Black universities, and the purpose therein in those institutions, was to create workers that would then feed back into the economy. It was essentially to create laborers that would then form back into the economy and contribute without benefiting directly from the labor. So more than anything else, these historically Black institutions were spaces for precarious labor, or for facilitating growth around precarious labor and exploitation of Black people, and indoctrinating us to understand and to think of ourselves as a labor force that is only meant to contribute to the labor of the country and nothing more. So that is the background, just briefly, of the history of education in South Africa, to say that it was for a particular class of people, a particular race of people. And when 1994 came, and something that is particularly very interesting to mention is that when former President Nelson Mandela and the ANC, which is the African National Congress, which is the leading or the ruling political party in South Africa, was campaigning for freedom, or for elections in 1994, they campaigned particularly to the youth around the concept of providing them with free quality education. So from the onset, the Fees Must Fall movement draws inspiration from the fact that free quality education was promised to us when, our ruling party was campaigning to take over the country in 1994. And that, to a large extent, is one of the reasons why a lot of the young people came out to vote, because they believed that they would be voting for a party that would ensure that everyone would be able to, access institutions of higher learning, because we believe that education becomes the equalizer in our society, especially considering, the apartheid history that we had and the way that the country was run. We considered education to be an equalizer. And from that particular point of view, the Fees Must Fall movement then goes back to say in 1994, we were promised free education. Fast forward to 2015, 24 years later, we still don't have that free education. And more than anything else, access into institutions of higher learning continues to be restricted. Next slide, please. So the Fees Must Fall movement then begins in October, after the RHODES Must Fall movement had started in Cape Town at the University of Cape Town in March. And what then happens is that from, the RHODES Must Fall movement, we see an uprising of South Africans who are in the UK, who launched their own version of the RHODES Must Fall movement under RHODES Must Fall UK, essentially sending solidarity and supporting the Fees Must Fall movement. So when the RHODES Must Fall movement then begins to jump over into other countries, we find ourselves moving outside of the context of just South Africa to being more global, where we have, young people from all across the world, not only supporting the movement, but also holding demonstrations in order to fight or help us fight for free, quality, decolonized education. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the beginning of the Fees Must Fall movement, the movement began as a peaceful movement, as a peaceful demonstration. And one of the images that I put up there, which is titled The First Day of the Fees Must Fall Shutdown, this was particularly at the University of the Witwatersrand, which is the institution that I attended. And what you see there is you see students blockading entrance to the university as a symbol to say that, we can no longer continue with the way that things are going. And essentially we are shutting down the institution until our demands are met. One of those demands being the removal of the fee increase, but another one also, and at the heart of the Fees Must Fall movement, being the decolonization of our curriculum. So as you see, students are peacefully demonstrating, holding hands, and essentially saying that they will not move or they will not be moved until their demands are met. In the second picture, what you see is, students marching to Luthuli House. So Luthuli House happens to be the headquarters of the African National Congress, which is the ruling party in South Africa. And as you see there as well, students are very peaceful. In fact, we're sitting on the road. At that particular point in time, we were leading a movement with over 500,000 young people. It's a little difficult to see, but the masses stretch far beyond what the eye can see in that particular image. And you have a situation where students from all over the province of Gauteng have come out in support of the Fees Must Fall movement to present demands at Luthuli House to the governing party, which is the ANC. Next slide, please. So when looking at the Fees Must Fall movement, one of the central tenets and one of the motivations around this, the Fees Must Fall movement was a quote from Frantz Fanon, which says that each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. And at that particular point in time, the Fees Must Fall movement was then considered to be a continuation of the 1976 struggle that happened in 1976 in Soweto, which was an uprising by students, by learners who were refusing to be taught in Afrikaans, which was the medium of instruction during apartheid. So from changing the curriculum and the medium of instruction in 1976, Fast forward to Fees Must Fall, what we understood was that our generational obligation as young people, as activists, was to continue the struggle that the youth of 76 had started around education and the tenets of education and how we receive our education. Next slide, please. So the Fees Must Fall movement then, grows into a national movement that moves outside of Wits University and goes into other institutions. So that would be historically Black institutions and historically white institutions in the country. And we finally then decide to go to the center of power in the country, which is the union buildings. And this is where our government sits. This is the administrative capital of the country, which is based in Pretoria. And as young people, we descend upon the union buildings. We have students busing in from all provinces, or I think in the States, it's called different states, from all the different states in the country. We have young people busing in and coming to the union buildings to demonstrate to the president, who was fortunately enough in his office in the union buildings at the time, to say that our movement is one that would not be deterred by promises of a 0% increment. Because when we got to the union buildings, we were having negotiations with government and we're having negotiations with our institutions of higher learning to say that, okay, fine, they won't increase, our fees, but to a large extent, the 0% fee increment did not, pacify students enough for us to stop demonstrating and to stop the Fees Must Fall movement, because there was still the question around decoloniality and decolonization that had to be sorted out. So more than anything else, we descended upon the union buildings in our numbers. And these are, till today, the number of people that went to the union buildings has to be, in the history of South Africa, the largest number of protesting people that have ever gone to the administrative capital of South Africa with demands that were then, to a certain degree, partially met by the state. Next slide, please. So the Fees Must Fall movement had always been a peaceful movement that unfortunately then turned violent. And the violence that came within the movement was started by the state. So the state's response to students peacefully protesting, as you see in all the images I've put up, where students would, come and occupy an area and sit down in order to be addressed and to address as well, was that we were met by, physical brute force from the state. So we had police descended on us, we had private security, and the private security that institutions of higher learning had hired to protect buildings and to protect, the property of the university were ex-militia more than anything else. And so what happened was a peaceful struggle then turned violent. And this is why, to a large extent, a lot of people consider the Fees Must Fall movement to be a violent movement, when in actual fact, it started off very peacefully. But what happened was that, the state then unleashed violence on students, and students then decided to retaliate with violence. Next slide, please. As you see there, those are some of the images of, the kind of brutality and the kind of violence that was meted against students. To a large extent, students were tear gassed, students were burnt, students were shot at with rubber bullets. In some instances, at some institutions in the country, they were shot with live ammunition. To date, we have recorded approximately 15 people who lost their lives and more than 100 people who were physically injured. And physically injured by private security and the police, which is the South African police service in the country. And more than anything else, this speaks to violence and the fact that, violence was used as the last refuge of an incompetent government and an incompetent institution of higher learning. Next slide, please. So in the midst of, dealing with police brutality, in the midst of dealing with state repression, there was obviously issues around the gendered nature of the Fees Must Fall movement, because in incorporated within the violence that the state, through the police service, was inflicting on students, and private security from institutions of higher learning were inflicting on students, were issues around, gender-based violence that female students had to face in institutions of higher learning. And this becomes the rise of what is now called Mbogodo lead. Mbogodo essentially is an African word for a female leader. And you see from a large extent where, women within the Fees Must Fall movement then decided to embark on a naked protest. And the naked protest was done for two particular reasons. The first reason was to form a barrier to protect students from police brutality, because when we were naked and our bodies were exposed, the police didn't shoot at us. The police didn't physically handle us because, at that particular point in time, we're naked people. But more than anything else, it also dealt with a lot of the gender-based violence that female students were faced with inside the movement, internally, from other students, and also from, private security and other forces as well. So Mbogodo lead then comes up, and you have, female students essentially protesting and putting their bodies on the line in order to safeguard themselves, their fellow students, in order to force the message across to the state that we would not change our minds with regards to free, quality, decolonized education, and also to speak to our fellow comrades and our fellow activists that, there was no space, there was no time, and there was no need for gender-based violence within the movement, because we were supposed to be a unified collective that didn't, inflict on each other the kinds of violence that the state was inflicting on us. And this is where you see the rise of Mbogodo lead. And you see women in the country all over, across institutions of higher learning, engaging in naked protests, lying on the street, and essentially advocating and fighting for free, quality, decolonized education using their naked bodies. Next slide, please. So I particularly come into the fold of the Fees Must Fall movement in 2015 to lead the movement as a female activist, because at the time, the nature of the movement, was very patriarchal. We had what we considered to call the Fantastic Four. So we had leaders of the Fees Must Fall movement who were predominantly males. And at that particular point in time, before even the Mbogodo lead and the feminist movement inside the Fees Must Fall movement arose, we had a situation where we needed more female representation within the student movement. And this is where I come in particularly to lead the feminist element of the Fees Must Fall movement. And my leadership in the movement then moved from being at Wits University to being one nationally. So in some of the images that you'll see there, you'll see me being dragged off a soccer pitch, which is actually really funny now that I think about it. Even though I'm still banned from every single stadium in the country, I decided to take the Fees Must Fall banner and disrupt a national soccer match that was playing, because at that particular point in time, I didn't understand why, as a country, we would focus on a soccer match when students were calling for free education. So I decided to infiltrate a very contested soccer match that people had been waiting for months. I disrupted that soccer match. I got arrested. I was arrested a lot of times during the Fees Must Fall movement. And to a large extent, my leadership then took a more international outlook when, I got arrested as a female student who was representing, a lot of the issues that, our patriarchal Fantastic Four had not considered when the Fees Must Fall movement began in October 2015. Next slide, please. Oh. Thank you. I actually could talk a lot about the Fees Must Fall movement, but more than anything else, I think at the center of it all is the call for decolonization, and decolonization becomes important because it speaks to African epistemology within our curriculum. It speaks to a curriculum that identifies the fact that, it is a curriculum that is meant to teach Black people, predominantly Black people, in a country that has a history like apartheid. Thank you. Hi, Claude.
Oh, thank you, Busisiwe. This is, we have so much to unpack here, but let me get started with something that Professor Evan Lieberman wrote in his latest book, Until We Have Won Our Liberty, which again, as I said earlier, is about South African liberation movements. And in chapter 8, which is probably my favorite chapter in the whole book, the chapter is actually titled Respect, Belonging, and Recognition. And he wrote, nationally and in recent years, the figure most squarely in protesters' crosshairs has been Cecil Rhodes. For university students in countries around the world, including South Africa, Rhodes's name has long been associated with academic excellence. It is synonymous with the prestigious fellowship that allows students to study at Oxford. And one of South Africa's leading universities also bears his name. Just as in the case of America's Woodrow Wilson, Rhodes's own history of racism turned out to be too profound to ignore. And owing to his involvement in education, his likeness has literally stared politically active students in the face throughout the post-apartheid period. So this is what you described there. And I want you to maybe, for this audience, which is mainly students, MIT students and other students, explain to us how in the post-apartheid period, the figure of Cecil Rhodes continued to be revered as a symbol of academic excellence.
Thank you. I think it's important for us to just briefly, very quickly, contextualize who exactly is Cecil John Rhodes in order for you to be able to understand why he becomes such a central figure around, decolonization of our, curriculum, and also becomes, the launch pad through which the Fees Must Fall movement then extends itself from, institutions of higher learning, or from symbols of imperialism, symbols of whiteness, symbols of colonialism, into a movement that was about free, quality, decolonized education. So Cecil was one of the leading figures in British imperialism at the end of the 19th century, pushing the empire to seize control over vast areas of Southern Africa, first as a businessman and later as a prime minister of the Cape Colony, which is now called Cape Town, in South Africa. And Rhodes had both financial and political reasons for doing this. He co-founded De Beers Diamond Company. And if you know anything about, the De Beers Diamond Company, particularly in South Africa, in Rhodes's lifetime, the company controlled about 90% of the world's diamond mines. So more than anything else, Cecil John Rhodes represents, a kind of racism that, Black people in South Africa have not been able to forget, a kind of racism that has become institutionalized, a kind of racism that is passive, but yet still very much aggressive. So Cecil John Rhodes becomes the father of, to a large extent, colonialism outside of those that arrived in 1652 in South Africa. So Cecil John Rhodes was a reminder, and the statue of Cecil John Rhodes was, for Black students in South Africa, it came across as though we were celebrating or we were acknowledging someone who positively contributed to the history of the country, when in actual fact, he was one of the archetypes of, apartheid, one of the archetypes of the degree and level of racism that we faced as Black people, because racism is not the same everywhere, and its expression is also not the same. The kind of racism that, Black people faced in South Africa is particularly very different from, the kind of racism that people of color in America faced, or people of color anywhere else in the world faced. So Cecil John Rhodes then becomes, to a large extent, a symbol and a reminder of a very painful past in South Africa. It becomes a symbol and a reminder of the privileges of whiteness, and how, racism has been institutionalized, and how it continues to permeate in our society in different industries, from, creating class divisions in society, to creating, to a large extent, or dismantling the nucleus or the nuclear family that we have come to know as being, particularly very important. So Cecil John Rhodes becomes a reminder of a very painful past. So his statue becomes a sort of celebration that Black people, particularly young Black people, did not understand why it had to remain, considering the fact that we were 24 years into what is supposed to be a democratic country.
So Rhodes died in 1902, and that was more than a century ago. And if we really kind of look at what's been happening in recent history, one other thing that Evan Lieben writes in his book is that even in post-apartheid South Africa, with Black-led local, provincial, and national governments, the system still seems stacked against Black South Africans. Now, you are, in addition to being an activist, you're now involved in politics, and you're aligned with the EFF, the Economic Freedom Fighters. Can you tell us about why you chose political action as the new form of expression after the Fees Must Fall became such an important movement in South Africa?
One of the reasons why I chose political participation was because during the Fees Must Fall movement, as students, we had written extensively around the feasibility of free education and where the money would come from, because that was one of the biggest questions that came out of the movement, where people were asking, you want free education, but where's the money going to come from? So we had written extensively around the feasibility of free education. We had written extensively around what does decolonization mean? What does it look like? How then does it play out within our education system? Where should it begin? Do we start decolonization in kindergarten and then it moves up all the way to institutions of higher learning, or do we just start it at institutions of higher learning for the particular few that are able to gain access? So we had written extensively, and one thing that I particularly found was that regardless of how much we wrote and how much sense everything we wrote made, there was no political will from the side of the state. There was no political will from the side of our leaders politically in the country to implement or effect a lot of the suggestions that we had, a lot of the demands that we had, a lot of the promises that they had made themselves and continue to make every single year when they campaigned for local government, provincial government, or even national government. So what I found was that in order for me to tangibly effect the change that I would like to see in society, it would be pertinent for me then to create political will, to be able to contribute to pushing politicians and the political elite in the country to be able to not only listen to young people, but to also be able to take, a lot of the recommendations and instructions that were coming from, the youth of the country, academics, workers, and the labor force in the country. So political will became one of the instrumental reasons why I started working in politics. Working for the Economic Freedom Fighters became a natural transition for me, considering that, the Economic Freedom Fighters is a Marxist-Leninist Fanonian political party that I identify with, considering the fact that, I am a Marxist at heart. I read a lot of Lenin. I quote Fanon every second day in half of the things that I do. So it became a natural transition for me to join that political party, because when you look at the fees, when you look at the EFF, for an example, one of the tenets of the EFF is the restoration of land. So one of the demands of the EFF becomes land redistribution without compensation. And when you look at Cecile John Rhodes, outside of him being a glorified mass murderer who exploited Black labor, he also stole the land from indigenous people. So the EFF becomes a political party that wants to restore the dignity of Black people in the country, that wants the return of the land to be under state control for everyone's collective use. So the Economic Freedom Fighters then became the political party that would then advance a lot of the ideals that the Fees Must Fall movement represented and was fighting for around decolonization and how it should happen, the restoration of land, and many other demands. And another thing with regards to the Fees Must Fall movement was that outside of students being individuals that came to form a collective in the movement, the Fees Must Fall movement was also heavily influenced by the EFF Student Command. A lot of the leaders of the EFF Student Command were also leaders of the Fees Must Fall movement across the country, myself included. And you begin to understand then and see the political nuance between the Fees Must Fall movement and the EFF when it comes to free, quality, decolonized education. And the restoration of land, amongst other things. So joining the EFF and working in government then became a natural transition for me to be able to implement a lot of the demands that students had made, a lot of the demands that are coming from, those people in our country that are facing socioeconomic issues and challenges. The EFF becomes an outlet for those people, because I consider the EFF to be a vanguard of Black people, particularly around, Marxist, Leninist, and Fanonian ideology.
I want to collapse two questions in the Q&A into one before I hand it over to Theo Sandy Francis, who is the MIT student who will ask the final question before I take the microphone back. And Kyle Marston is asking what kind of tools you use to keep your movement organized and effectively communicate to your membership. And in the same spirit, Aliko Songolo, who admires your courageous leadership, is saying that many other students across Africa face similar problems. Has your movement, as in Fees Must Fall, thought of ways of organizing such protests in other countries in order to impact the political landscape? So if you could answer those two questions, that would be great.
Okay, I'll start with the one around, other movements on the continent. Yes, we have. There are various other movements that we have worked with and continue to work with across the country. We also find and draw inspiration from movements like Black Lives Matter, from the End SARS movement in Nigeria, and other collective movements in countries like Zambia, the DRC, and Zimbabwe. And we are in conversation with young people in those countries to see how we can effectively support them and to also provide them with the necessary media attention that is required for their movements and their struggles to be recognized not only internationally, but also in their country. And this becomes important because during apartheid, one of the leverages that afforded, the emancipation movement an opportunity to actually gain emancipation was the attention that the international community then gave, the struggle against apartheid. So we understand the importance that the international community plays, and we do actively work to support other movements, be it financially or also be it ideologically. We host seminars quite often. We travel back and forth to go and support one another. We protest at each other's embassies continuously all the time. We write, we do a lot of things to support other movements across the continent. Because the call for free, quality, decolonized education is not one that is only specific to South Africa, but that also extends to the whole continent of Africa, considering the fact that our education system is a colonial education system. It is one, like I mentioned earlier on, that is meant to reproduce and exploit laborers. So more than anything else, and also speaking into the first question around the tools that we used a lot of tools, from naked protesting. We did art installations and demonstrations. We had musicians in the country, such as the late AKA, who just passed away, such as Thandiswa Mazwai. We had various artists as well in the country supporting the movement that would then, have free concerts. So we used to have a free education live concert where we would have artists come over who supported the movement. And in that instance, because South Africa is a very vibrant country that loves a good time, we love a good time in South Africa, we decided to have a free education live concert in order to merge art installations, in order to merge the contribution from the art industry into the movement and their support support, and the funds that were then gathered from those free concerts, to a large extent through donations, were then used to support the movement, were then used also to support other movements in countries like Zimbabwe, the DRC, and Nigeria, like I mentioned. So there were many tools that we used: naked protest, art installations. We wrote extensively, we published extensively, we hosted podcasts, we had a FISMAS 4 radio station that particularly sought to teach people around the importance of the movement and why the movement was so important and so pertinent at this particular point in time in our history, considering that our democracy is only 24 years old. So we had a lot of things, and we used a lot of tools. We involved different stakeholders in society. We had NGOs, we had civil society organizations, we had parents involved. We even had young people. In one of the images in my presentation, there's an image of young people who are considered, I think it's kindergarten, here it's like primary school, in primary school, who formed part of our protesting and were on the streets with us. We protested, we did a lot. We used every and any tool at our disposal in order to get our message across, and also to galvanize support for the movement.
Theo, you have the floor. Please introduce yourself before asking your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Claude. Thank you, Busisiwe. Yours is an incredibly powerful story, drawing on a resilient history of Black South African youth taking change into their own hands. My name's Theo. I'm an MIT student, and my first question has to do with access, kind of besides the fees themselves. I was fortunate through MIT Africa, to get to work with some students from the townships around PE, or now officially Beja, earlier this year. And one of the things that they told me about was the logistical challenges just getting to class. Many of them are unable to get loans to live on campus. Public transportation takes prohibitively long. And so even for the universities in their city, oftentimes, even though they would be star students if they could go, the logistics are insurmountable. So as we think about kind of systems of oppression evolving instead of resolving, I'm wondering what you are thinking about in terms of kind of secondary barriers to access to education, and what other systemic changes need to happen to facilitate the free, quality, and decolonialized education that you're talking about.
Thank you very much, Theo. That's a loaded question. Thank you. More than anything else, I think your experience with students from Beja is a true reflection of some of the issues that the FISMAS 4 movement attempts to resolve. And the FISMAS 4 movement wasn't a movement that happened and has since, degenerated or passed. It continuously happens every single year, and it also happened again this year, but particularly around access. For an example, in 1994, when we transitioned from apartheid into a democratic state, a democratic South Africa, what happened was we had about 32 institutions of higher learning that were then merged, and we only have about 21 institutions of higher learning at the moment. So from 36 down to 21, you can see to a large extent that the struggle for space is going to be a contestable issue. It's going to be a very big issue. Even where you are able to get, you can apply to an institution of higher learning. I'll make an example with Wits University. Wits University has about 60,000 students in total, regardless of what year you're studying, but it can only accommodate a particular number of first-year students or undergraduate students. So and you have a situation where it will only be able to accommodate approximately like 3,000 first-year students, and you have over 200,000 people who are applying. So out of the 200,000, only 3,000 are going to be able to get access into the institution of higher learning. And even when they do get access into an institution of higher learning, there's the issue around the feasibility or affording to be able to participate in the academic activities of the university. This moves from accommodation is extremely expensive. And part of the Fees Must Fall movement, or one of the programs in the Fees Must Fall movement and the EFF Student Command particularly, was around accommodation as land. And this also goes back to, the restoration of land and land redistribution. But accommodation becomes a very big issue because although, you are able to access the institution of higher learning in terms of the fact that you are granted space, there's not enough residences for students to occupy. Even if you go externally outside of the university to look for accommodation, there's not enough space even externally. The fees or the cost of private accommodation, as we call it, is also very high. And this comes in a country that has a very high unemployment rate. So you're already coming from a very disadvantaged background where none of your parents are working, if you're fortunate enough to even have parents to begin with. And then you are offered a space in the university. You have to organize money to move from home to the university, either on a daily basis or once off moving into a residence. You get to the university, there is no residential space for you. You get to the university, there is no food. We also had issues around food and the kind of food that students were being served in, the dining halls, as we call it. So there's a lot of issues outside of just accessing the institution in terms of being a student that the Fees Must Fall movement sought to address, that are still very big issues today, accommodation being one of the central ones, but also the curriculum being a very big part of it, because you move from a basic education system where you haven't been taught how to use a computer, where you haven't been taught how to type, and you get to university and you're expected to type every single assignment. And for a lot of people that are coming from rural areas, South Africa has a lot of rural areas. It's not as developed as it should be 24 years into its democracy. So you have a lot of young people coming in from rural areas. And in that particular instance, they are unable to bridge the gap between the Bantu style education that they received into this, new modern colonial kind of education system. So more than anything else, I would say, when it comes to what needs to be done, we need to have an entire rehaul of the education system in South Africa, systematically, institutionally, from a fees perspective, from a land perspective, from an accessibility perspective. I mean, I could go on all day, really, that the issues are so long. And I think that's why I recommend some of the readings that I'm hoping that Claude will share with all of you to shed a bit more light. Yes. As to what must then happen from here, and how do we tangibly, realistically affect the kind of change that we want to see. I hope I answered your question, Theo.
Thank you, Busisiwe. We have to wrap up because we're at time now. Thank you, Theo, for the question. I will share your 3 books in the PDF that we will put on the True Africa University website. And I do have to say that this has been a fascinating conversation, Busisiwe. We want to thank you for your passion, for everything that you bring to this discourse around liberation in South Africa and around the world. Next week, next Thursday, we have a session with Kuzanai Chirai, who's one of Africa's foremost contemporary artists, and he's going to tell us about certain records and that he's been collecting and what they reveal about Africa's forgotten heroes. And this is going to be a really interesting discussion with an artist who lives between South Africa and Zimbabwe. Thank you all for tuning in. See you next week. Have a wonderful evening, afternoon, or morning, depending where you are.